Do you ever notice how on modern smartphones, when you open the selfie camera, there's this little toggle to give you a wider field of view? Maybe to capture more of your surroundings or people if, unlike me, you actually have friends. But at the same time, your phone only has one selfie camera on the front. Well, you might just have to thank Google's Pixel 3 XL for that. This wasn't the first phone to rock two cameras up front, LG had done this prior, but I'd argue that Google took this further and really popularised the concept. The 3XL was lamented by critics and smartphone fans alike for its screen cutout up top, which was creatively named bathtub notch. It was huge, it was in the way, it was ugly. No one liked the bathtub notch, and Google clearly got on board because the Pixel 3XL was the only Pixel to have a notch at all, let alone one that looked like this. It made room for two 8-megapixel cameras, one ultra-wide camera, whose field of view was almost GoPro-like, and a second, far more tame example that narrows the field of view, but also cut down on distortion. At the time, it kind of made sense, sort of, for this distinction to be done in hardware, as the cost of a second camera really wasn't that high, and it meant you could have the best of both worlds as a selfie taker. It made sense to have the two options, and people who liked taking group selfies benefited from that extra field of view. By the way guys, I'm really trying to hit 100,000 subscribers, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button, it really would mean the world to me. The reason we have the option for both now, but only have one camera, isn't simply because the camera is just cropping in, but other factors have to come into play. See, our current selfie cameras do have wider lenses than the ones of old, to enable that wider field of view. But when you select the more zoomed in option, the phone's processing pipeline is applying a lens correction to counteract the distortion a wide lens typically gives you, along with cropping in and a bunch of other stuff to make sure that selfies don't look like a fisheye lens. This phone boosted that trend, and though its camera in general was held in high regard at the time due to Google's impressive and still quite novel computational photography, it was all about selfies with this model. The rear camera, yep, singular, could capture some really solid images despite its diminutive sensor, and would be shared not only with its predecessor, but the next two phones to come after it. It's something that we all take for granted now. Phones with big sensors, big lenses, multiples of them, but this is all you got with the 3XL, and it delivered tremendously. Even today, photos taken with it come out looking fantastic, and if I didn't tell you that these were taken on a 6-year-old device, you probably wouldn't be able to know, at least in good lighting conditions. This thing is still top shelf, and that's a testament to just how good Google's computational photography is. The 3XL isn't my favourite phone, not by a long way. It's not even my favourite Pixel. That would be the 2XL, which you can learn more about in the linked video. However, this phone feels phenomenal in the hand. The curved sides, the glass back, the thin profile, it all just feels incredible, and I think that might be one of the most underrated parts of the 3XL. Even though it doesn't look incredible, it feels good. And that was important to the user experience. And speaking of, this phone is 6 years old, as I said earlier. It's not a perfect user experience in 2024. It's more than usable, but it has lacked that cutting edge for a while now. Funnily enough, because it's a Snapdragon powered phone and not the Tensor version, it's still pretty powerful, I guess. In the lower end games and darting around the OS, it's still pretty decent. It's a Snapdragon 845 that was used in the 3XL. It's one of Qualcomm's better chips if you ask me. And I think this pill navigation system is also really odd. I never liked it when it came out, and I don't like it now. I was a stickler for keeping the old 3-button navigation about, as I was kind of old school in that sense, but I'm so glad we have landed on the intuitive swiping gestures that we now have that kind of spawned in iOS and we brought over to Android. This was a little dark age for Pixel navigation. I'm so glad that we have that newer system now. It's just way more intuitive. The 3XL released with Android 9 Pie, but finished getting updates on Android 12. So it's still possible to load up your favourite apps and get some stuff done. It's not a perfect experience, as I said before, but it's possible to use. I mean, it's 4 gigs of RAM, which might not sound like a lot, but it kind of worked on here. It is mad that phones these days have like 16 gigs of RAM. The latest Pixel has 16 gigs. It's mental. You can install Android 14 via third-party ROMs if you're comfortable doing that kind of thing, and that will fix a lot of the compatibility issues that you might find with the stock software. It's not the sort of thing I do these days. 10 years ago, sure, but not in 2024. More of a stock software kind of guy. This phone still has Bluetooth 5, AC Wi-Fi, USB-C 3.1 speeds, 18-watt wired charging and wireless charging thanks to that glass back. It's still IP68 rated with stereo front-firing speakers which were kept on from the Pixel 2 series, also 2 storage SKUs, 64GB and 128. It feels strange that 64GB phones were almost useless these days, as the second you load a game or two it's basically full. That's all the storage gone. This wasn't the case back in 2018 and 64GB isn't really that bad. I actually really like the rear fingerprint scanner. I'm sad we did away with these things on the whole and went for in-display ones because I just think the rear capacitive ones are way better, don't at me. Thanks to Damien Ward for sending this phone over, by the way, completely forgot about that. The proper QHD POLED screen, it's only 60Hz, but it's crazy sharp. This is a sharper display than the Pixel 9 phones. I think that we've sort of toned down the insane sharpness to deliver better battery life and to make games easier to run. But yeah, when you hold one of these things right up to your face and get as close as possible, you can see just how sharp these old displays used to be. Pretty overkill if I'm honest. Unneeded, but absolutely insane. This phone released at a whopping £870 here in the UK. That was a considerable jump from the previous model and almost made a statement. Google's aiming for the high end with its phones, that it would then flip-flop on a couple of generations, but we forget about that. Looking back, £800 for this sort of phone was absolutely insane and laughable when you think of the incredible devices that have launched since for less money that pack way more into their bodies. You can pick up a 3XL on eBay today for less than £100. No, this isn't one of those videos where I assess whether you should buy and use one day to day. The answer would just clearly be no, but it is interesting to find phones that you might not have once been able to afford. This was well out of my price range when it released, and how low their prices are now. I mean, this costs less than half the price of a new pair of AirPods Pros. Absolutely madness. It's kind of unfortunate that the phone before the 3XL was absolutely game-changing and a legend that many Android fans like myself completely adored, and then the phone that came after the 3XL was some mental experimental type thing that took all the headlines and largely changed the discussion entirely. It's almost like the 3XL was a forgotten middle child between those two and is seldom brought up when talking about the best Pixels in the series. It probably doesn't help that the cut down 3A was also a massive deal, not only for Google helping save its Pixel line, which you can learn about in this video in the links comments, but also to tech in general, proving that you really could buy a cheaper or mid-range smartphone with an excellent camera and very good software. Yeah, that phone meant a lot to a lot more people and it really overshadowed the 3 and the 3XL in my opinion. The Pixel 3 XL really set the trend for interesting selfie camera setups that we have in our smartphones in 2024. It might not have been the first, but it sure was interesting, whether you liked the phone or you didn't.